Hi, I'm Pete Holloway. I'm a retired financial advisor and a retired certified financial planner. And as always, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to On Money. Today, we have one of my favorite, if not my most favorite guests, John Deskins. He is the director of the WVU Business and Economic Research at WVU. And basically, I think you could say his job title is chief economist for the state of West Virginia. When the legislature goes into session, one of the very first meetings they have is with John when he explains to them what's going on. He's a Virginia native, got his degrees in economics from Emory and the University of Tennessee. John, we're going to let you run things. And I want to warn everybody, there are going to be a lot of slides. Okay, this is a college station. We should be okay with slides. He explains them very well, and they're going to be full of information. This is a two-part show. This week, we're going to be talking about the state of West Virginia. Next week, we're going to be talking about the Wheeling metro area, which covers the entire viewing area for this broadcast. John, you're on.
Great. Pete, thanks so much for having me on. I always enjoy coming on your show every year. Always really happy to do it. I'll share my screen here real quick so we can, get the visuals up in front of us. My presentation is pretty numbers driven, so it's important to have those visuals to look at. And as you said, today I'll talk about the state economy, and next week I'll come back and talk about the local economy here in the Wheeling area. And also next week, in addition to the local talk, I'll talk about some economic development challenges that we have to address and overcome in West Virginia to achieve the prosperity that we really hope for in our state. I just will say, here's a link to the full economic outlook report. Every year we produce what we call the West Virginia Economic Outlook Report. You can follow that link to get the full report. I'm just going to be really covering the tip of the iceberg today, but if you're interested in, planning around what's happening in our economy, this report has a lot of detail to guide you on what we see happening in our state and our region, and it really has an industry by industry analysis as well. So a lot more detail there. Here's the basic rundown of the things that I have to talk about. I'll just kind of give you the preview before we get into the detail as we go through the talk today. First and foremost, the COVID recession that we suffered in 2020 was the fastest economic collapse that we've seen in at least modern economic history. But here we stand in the fall of 2022, and we have essentially recovered from the COVID recession. That's good news. That's a very good thing. So it should be a time to celebrate, to say, well, COVID recession's over with. We have gotten back to the level of employment in West Virginia that we saw in January of 2020. Good news, reason to celebrate, but we can't really celebrate yet. The fact of the matter is, after COVID, we've seen several factors that have come together to create a great deal of uncertainty nationally. And right now, there's a pretty good probability that we might see a recession nationally in the near future. So that's really important to understand, because if we do have a national recession, that will certainly have implications for West Virginia. So kind of have good news and bad news. We made it through COVID, that's good, but we can't celebrate because of this uncertainty that we see nationally. Now, overall, I don't want to give away my whole story here, really, but overall, we don't expect a recession to occur in West Virginia. We do expect growth to continue, but honestly, we expect the growth to be pretty slow because of these pressures that we see nationally that affect West Virginia. That really points to slow growth for the state and for the nation. And again, today and next time as well, I'll talk about long-term challenges that we face and have faced in West Virginia for a long time. We have to recognize those challenges if we're ever going to overcome them. But we also have opportunities. There are good things happening in different parts of West Virginia, so there are reasons to be excited as well. And one final point, I won't get into this too much today, but I'll make a big deal of it next week. The successes that we have in West Virginia are frankly just too concentrated. The good things that we have, the good news stories, tend to be clustered in just a few different parts of our state. So, in some ways that's good. We want those good things to continue to happen. We want to continue to accelerate growth in those successful areas, but we really have to focus on getting the good news to spread out to other parts of our state geographically, because we are far too concentrated right now in terms of the good news. So before I talk about West Virginia, I will spend just a couple minutes talking about the national economy. Like I said, if we have a national recession, that's going to impact West Virginia. So you have to understand that national context to really understand where we're heading in West Virginia in our economy. So this is no shocker. This is the big issue that we all know about: inflation. Here's the inflation statistic that you see in front of you. As you see, we're talking about inflation that's around 8%. We're talking about the highest rates of inflation that we've seen in this country since the early 1980s. This is a real challenge for everyone. It's a challenge for individuals. It's a challenge for businesses. It's a challenge for governments. And it creates a lot of hardship for a lot of folks across the country and a lot of businesses across the country. The reason that we have this 40-year high in inflation is really a combination of four factors that have come together to create all this inflationary pressure. First and foremost, the one that's really obvious is oil prices or gas prices. You don't have to have me to tell you about how much gas prices have increased. We can all just see that when we go to the pump every week. That's an important driver of inflation in a very direct sense, because gas is an important part of typical households' purchasing. But that also feeds into every other good of the economy, because every good has to be transported from one place to another. Higher gas prices increase the cost of producing just about anything in the economy. The second factor that has emerged since COVID are these global supply chain constraints. Because of some shifts in purchasing that we observed during COVID, and because of various lockdowns across the world, especially in China, because of various constraints at ports across the world when we ship goods across the ocean, we found that a lot of goods are just difficult to get, difficult to find. This has been the case for over 2 years now. When a good like a car, for example, is hard to find, well, that shortage drives up the price. This is exactly why used cars have increased by 50%, over some window of time over the past couple years. The third factor is labor force shortages. Over the course of COVID, we saw a lot of people just leave the labor force, people who quit working or quit looking for work to retire early or to go back to school or to be a stay-at-home mom or a stay-at-home dad. So when we have a situation where businesses have a hard time finding workers, they have to raise wages. They have to pay more to attract the workers that they need. Many times those higher wages are passed on to the consumer in the form of higher prices. That's a third source of inflationary pressure. And the fourth source is really aggressive fiscal and monetary stimulus policies that were in place during this COVID era. The federal government did a lot of things to cut taxes and boost spending to try to boost the economy. And the Federal Reserve engineered very, very low interest rates to try to boost the economy as well. Those factors increased demand in the economy, which also creates inflationary pressure. So 4 factors that just kind of came together at the same time to give us 40-year highs in our inflation rate to create this hardship that we're seeing now. So we have to get rid of this inflation, okay? That's a certainty. Economic history has told us that if we have a long-run period of high and volatile inflation, then that'll be extremely detrimental for long-run economic prosperity. So we have to get rid of this. We have to get back to a normal, acceptable rate of inflation, something around 2% that's stable. The best way to get there would be to just fix these individual problems. But that's not easy. If it were easy, we would have already done it. So we're left with a much more blunt instrument, and that is the way in which the Federal Reserve increases interest rates. The Federal Reserve has to increase interest rates first and foremost just to remove the stimulus that they provided to get us back to a more neutral level for interest rates. Then they might even have to raise interest rates even beyond that point to further push down demand in the economy, to choke inflation out of the economy. Here's a figure that shows you the federal funds rate, as you see there on the bottom. That's the key interest rate that the Federal Reserve targets. And then you can see a couple of other benchmark rates that, of course, move, to a large extent in sync with the federal funds rate. So you can see how much interest rates have increased. That's going to eventually choke inflation out of the economy. The concern is that the Federal Reserve might be too aggressive in raising interest rates, and they might push us into a recession. We hope the Federal Reserve is able to increase interest rates just enough at the exact right timing that it pushes demand that it pushes demand in the economy down just enough to bring prices down to get us back to 2% inflation, but doesn't tip us into a recession. But that's hard to do. The Federal Reserve hasn't really had to act in this way since the early 1980s. A lot of things have changed since then. We don't know what's going to happen. Time will tell. Maybe the Fed will be able to engineer that soft landing that I was talking about, or maybe we'll be a little bit too aggressive and the Fed will put us into a recession. That's the uncertainty. If we do fall into a recession, probability is pretty high. That will certainly impact us here in West Virginia. But that's the big question. For example, you see that stock markets have been crazy this year. That's because the market sees this uncertainty. The market sees the probability of a recession rising as the Fed acts to remove inflation from the economy. And the stock market doesn't like uncertainty. That's why we've seen this volatility and this big drop this year. And markets aren't going to return until we get through this period, until we get some resolution on inflation, until we see how this whole thing's going to resolve. We have to get through this before markets are ever going to get back to kind of what we hope to see. So that's the quick rundown of what we have nationally. Now let's turn to what we see happening in West Virginia. Here's the headline picture for our state. The blue line shows the total number of jobs in West Virginia. The yellow line is the total number of jobs nationally for comparison. When COVID hit, we lost about 95,000 jobs altogether. That's 14% of all the jobs in West Virginia were lost virtually overnight. We've seen job loss of that magnitude before in the early 80s and in the 1930s during the Great Depression. But we've never seen a collapse happen that quickly. But you can also see the recovery there. The quick recovery in 2020 when the lockdowns ended was very sharp. And then since then, over the past 2 years, the recovery has been pretty steady. The figure that you see in front of you is based on quarterly data, which we use in our forecasting, which is more reliable. These data show 95,000 jobs lost, 93,000 jobs gained back. So according to the figure that you see in front of you, we're only 2,000 jobs shy of where we were in January 2020. More recent monthly data that have come out actually show now a full recovery, and we expect the quarterly data to also show the full recovery when the quarterly data come out. There's a little bit more of a lag there, and those data are more reliable. But ultimately, we think the economy has fully recovered from COVID. We're just waiting on a confirmation from the most reliable data. That's good news to say that we fully recovered from COVID. The recovery honestly has been faster than I would have expected 2 or 2.5 years ago. This is the same data. It's just presented with an index approach so you can make a clean comparison between the state and the nation. You see the index went from 100 down to 86. That reflects the 14% job loss that I mentioned before. The reason I show this figure presented this way is just to illustrate how similarly we looked in the state and the nation as we went through this COVID recession and recovery. I don't exactly know why this is. I don't really have an explanation for it, but I am surprised at how close we have moved with the nation throughout this COVID period. For the first year and a half, we were almost identical to the nation. West Virginia has lagged the nation a little bit over the past year, but still very similar trajectory in the state and the nation over this COVID period. This figure shows you that the yellow bar in the middle shows you it reflects the fact that West Virginia, as of these data, stands at 99% of all the jobs that we had as of January 2020. Again, more recent data indicate that number is now up to 100%, but as of the time of these data, we were at 99% of all the jobs that we had in January of 2020. The fact that the figure is getting a little bit out of date doesn't change the point. The point is we have a lot of variation, though, across sectors in our economy. Construction has 106% of the jobs that it had in January 2020. Professional and business services, 104% of the jobs. Look down to other sectors like leisure and hospitality, only 96% of the jobs that we had before COVID. So even though I say the economy has almost fully recovered compared to January 2020, or it has fully recovered compared to January 2020, that doesn't mean that we look the same, because there's been a lot of movement across sectors. So we really do look very different, even though I say that we fully recovered. That's important to keep in mind. Here we see unemployment. Unemployment rate in West Virginia was about 5% before COVID. The number skyrocketed up to about 16%. But then we've seen a really, really rapid improvement in the unemployment rate over the last 2 years. We fell from 16% back to 5% where we started, and we've just continued to fall. Unemployment now in the state and in the nation stands at about 3.5% or so, and that is essentially a historic low. There may be a couple of times in the 60s or a couple of other periods in economic history where we were that low, but we've never really been any lower than that. We are essentially at a historic low in terms of the unemployment rate. Most of that improvement has come from people who were unemployed who found jobs. That's what you expect. That's what the unemployment rate is intended to capture. However, I will say that some of the improvement has come from labor force attrition. See, to be considered to be unemployed, you have to be looking for work. If you're retired, you're not considered unemployed because you don't want to work because you're retired. So you have to be actively looking for work. So as I said before, over the course of COVID, we've seen a lot of people who just left the labor force, who lost their jobs, were considered unemployed, but then they decided to quit looking for work and retire early or go back to school or decide to be a stay-at-home parent. When that happens, that actually causes the measured unemployment rate to fall. It's a little bit of a quirk with this statistic. So most of the improvement is legit, you might say, but some of the improvement is due to labor force attrition. So you have to remember that. And so the labor market the improvement hasn't been quite as good as what the statistic indicates. We still have a very strong and a very tight labor market, but both of those factors have to be understood. Now, this is the more important labor market indicator, and I kind of alluded to this already just a second ago, but here we see labor force participation. This captures the share of the adult population that wants to work. Never mind whether they're working or just looking for work. This is the share of the adult population that wants to work in the first place. Nationally, as you see, 62% of the adults want to work. In West Virginia, we're dead last among the states. We come in at just 55%. This is a big problem. I think this is the most important statistic to characterize the West Virginia economy. We're never going to get to where we need to be or where we want to be. We're never going to have a level of economic prosperity that's on par with the national average if we have the lowest share of our adults who are in the labor force. So one of our top economic development priorities has to be getting that blue bar to move to the right, has to be getting more West Virginians in the labor force. Next episode, next week, I'll come back and I'll talk more about how important this is and how this has to be one of their top economic development priorities to really get us to the prosperity that we hope to see. As far as labor force attrition goes, this figure shows the job openings rate for the state and for the nation. So the job openings rate right now is about 7 or 8% in West Virginia. That means that for every 100 jobs that employers want to have, about 7 or 8 of those jobs are currently unfilled. As you see, we can all see this, right? We see help wanted signs as we just go through town on a normal life. It's easy to see the labor force shortage problem, but it's pretty clearly manifest in the data as well. And as you see, the problem is a little bit worse in West Virginia, even compared to the nation. It's an important part of understanding where we stand in our economy right now. I'm almost ready to wrap up with this part of the talk, but here we see the number of people who are receiving unemployment insurance benefits in West Virginia from the government. Before COVID, it was about 17,000. It skyrocketed up to in excess of 140,000 when COVID was at its worst, but it fell very dramatically after COVID ended. Right now, we only have about 6,000 people in West Virginia who are receiving unemployment insurance benefits, and that's only, close to a third of what we had before COVID. So very, very few people receiving unemployment insurance benefits now. So far, I've mostly been talking about employment or unemployment. This figure shows you GDP, or it shows you the growth in GDP for the state and for the nation for the past. This is a pretty negative statistic in a lot of ways, because if you look back, if you count the West Virginia line versus the nation line, we have actually underperformed the nation for 10 years in a row now. GDP captures the total market value of all the stuff that we produce in our state. So that has grown more slowly than what we've seen nationally for 10 years. More reason to kind of understand the need to push forward to improve our economy. I'm going to skip over the energy section right now because I am running slow. I might come back later and talk about energy, but I want to get to the forecast section before this talk ends. Before I get to the forecast, though, I just want to say really quickly, how did my team do in the past with forecasting? Is for those of you who have seen me on here before, you know, every year we give a forecast. And it's important to kind of look back and think about how we did in the past. This is the figure that I showed in October of 2020, 2 years ago, right kind of in the middle of the COVID recession. The part on the left is actual data. The part on the right in gray is the forecast that we produced almost exactly 2 years ago. Okay, so this isn't new. This is old. This line shows what's actually happened with jobs. I'm bragging on my team here a little bit because the number of jobs that we saw in the fall of 2022 was within 0.3% of what we forecast 2 years prior. So I'm saying that our forecasting has been really good. Now, I'm not showing you our 2019 forecast, the forecast that we produced just before COVID. That forecast was terrible. But when we did a good job, I'm going to let you know our forecasting was right on track 2 years ago, and I'm really proud of what we're able to achieve there. But again, don't ask me for my 2019 forecast. So here's what we expect going forward. Again, the gray portion on the right is our forecast. So we don't expect a recession to hit. We could be wrong. A lot of people are calling for a 50% probability for a new recession, but we don't expect that. We expect growth to continue. We expect growth to continue for basically another year. And then honestly, we expect some flatness later on in the forecast period. Altogether, if you look at the 5-year forecast period that I have highlighted, we expect growth of 0.3% per year on average. That's a little bit less than national growth forecasts. And the forecast we rely on calls for 0.4% growth nationally over the forecast period. Now, these factors that I'm talking about nationally, these supply chain constraints, these oil prices, these labor force shortages, and the way in which the Fed is increasing interest rates very aggressively, that's going to put some pretty strong headwinds on our economy. That's going to put downward pressure on our economy. That's a big source of this flat growth that we expect going forward. Now, I will say, this isn't my hunch. This isn't my opinion. This isn't my gut feeling. This is based on an analysis of over 50 variables that characterize the West Virginia economy, statistics that we use to look at how those variables interact with each other. We use that understanding to construct the forecast going forward. This is purely based on numbers. And this is, the point here is to say, this is kind of based on the status quo. This is based on past patterns that we've seen in West Virginia. So to a large extent, this is what's going to happen if we keep doing what we've been doing. That's what the numbers indicate. This is not to say that if we work more aggressively to overcome the economic development challenges that we have before us, if we work more aggressively to capitalize on the economic development opportunities that we have before us, things can be better. Things can be better if we work harder and if we act more aggressively. But this is what we see based on a status quo analysis of the numbers. So, hopefully it'll be better. It can be better, but we have to be more aggressive to make it better. The blue bars here show you what's happened to growth in each sector over the past decade, and the yellow bars show you our forecast for growth going forward. I'm not going to go sector by sector because it just takes too much time, but if you look at the full report, which I mentioned before, you can see a lot of detail for each of those sectors. If you're in manufacturing, for example, if that's what you care about, you can look at the manufacturing portion of that full economic outlook report, and you can see a lot of detail behind why we think manufacturing is going to grow at the pace that we have forecast. Here's the unemployment rate forecast going forward. We actually think unemployment is going to rise in the state and in the nation, but that increase is going to be because more people start looking for work. Oddly enough, that's actually a good thing rather than a bad thing. Even though it means the measured statistic is higher, if more people start looking for work, if more people get out there, engaged in the labor force, might increase the measured unemployment rate, but that's actually going to be a good thing for our economy. And essentially, we think the rate's going to move back to what we consider to be the normal rate based on the long-run fundamentals in our economy in West Virginia. We think the normal rate's about 5%. We think we'll get back to that. That's an okay thing. It's not a problem. This figure forecasts the growth in income that we expect going forward. The reason I show this figure is to illustrate the issue around transfer payments versus wage and salary income and proprietor's income. The yellow bar represents the total growth in income, but we expect that transfer payment income is going to grow more rapidly than the total. Wage and salary income, proprietor's income, that's small business income, that's going to grow more slowly. Transfer payments, that's things like Social Security retirement benefits, Social Security disability benefits, welfare payments, other things like that, money that comes from Washington as a transfer. I don't mean to say that those transfer programs are bad in any way. They're important. They play an important role in our society. But if your economy is more and more dependent on transfer payments, that doesn't bode well for a growth forecast, because growth is driven by wage and salary income, proprietor's income, small business income. Transfer payment income is stable. It's good in a lot of ways, but it doesn't point to growth in the future. West Virginia is already the most reliant of the states on transfer payments from Washington, and we're only becoming even more reliant on transfer payments over time. Just important to understand that, because it does not bode well for economic growth, since those payments are stable, not growing. The last thing I'll point to relates to our demographics in West Virginia. The blue bars show you what's happened to the number of people in each of those age categories over the past decade. The yellow bars show you what we expect to happen to the number of people in each of those categories over the coming 5 years. Bottom line is, West Virginia has been getting older. Fewer people in those younger age groupings, more people in the 65 and older category. And we expect West Virginia to continue to get older. This is true nationally, but it's even more pronounced in West Virginia. This is a problem as we have more and more people of retirement age. It just makes it harder and harder to drive economic growth forward. There's not an easy solution to this, but it is something that's important to understand as we seek to really understand the West Virginia economy. Now, that's my total presentation for today. Aside from the energy section that I skipped, I'm sorry for kind of going over there. But that's the quick and dirty rundown of the state economy. I encourage you to look at that full report for a lot more detail. I'll be happy to come back next week and talk about the local economy and some economic development challenges that we have to overcome, and some opportunities as well.
John, can you repeat the website for the full report? And if they go directly to go to Google on WVU Business and Economic Research, would the report be found if they went just to Google and look exploring?
The easiest way by far is just simply to Google WVU Bureau of Business and Economic Research. That's by far the easiest way. That's easier than just typing in that long address that I mentioned, but just Google WVU Bureau of Business and Economic Research.
Yeah, for whether you're an individual or a business owner, this is vital. These are vital statistics that can really help your business. I want to thank you. We'll be talking to you and exploring further next week. I'm Pete Holloway. We'll be talking to you again. Thank you.